Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is a reading roundup. In this reading roundup, I'm going to share with you some of the books that I've read recently that are not connected to Victober. So these are just other books that I've read. Some of these are actually books that I read in September. And so let's just dive right into this. I'm not going to go really in any particular order. I'm just going to go with whatever's on top of my stack. So I read Murder Most Persuasive by Tracy Kiely. This is the third book in this series. It's a cozy mystery series set in the United States. The main character is Elizabeth Parker, and the books have this Jane Austen connection that I just love. Elizabeth Parker loves Jane Austen and she quotes from Jane Austen all the time. And so in this third book in the series, Elizabeth is at a funeral. Her great uncle has passed away, and the same day or right around the time of the funeral, his house in the Maryland town of St. Michael's has been sold, and the new owners are doing some work and they discover a body under the pool. They dig up the pool and they find the body of a man that everybody in the family thought had run off 8 years before. There's also this persuasion connection in this one because Elizabeth's cousin, Anne, had been engaged to Detective Joe Muldoon 8 years before and was persuaded by her family to break it off with him. And what do you want to know? He is the detective who is investigating this body that was found. And so that was very entertaining. I do quite enjoy this series. It's a fun, cozy read. This one, and actually in all of them probably, now that I think about it, there's some mild language, so if that bothers you, be aware of that. I love that along with all the quoting that Elizabeth herself does, there's always a quote from Jane Austen at the beginning of every chapter. This is the thing. The author has an obvious love for Austen, and she knows the stories well enough to weave naturally into a modern day story. And that's what I really enjoy. So here's an example. So there's a group of people talking, including Joe Muldoon, who is the Captain Wentworth character. And he's talking about how he enjoys sailing, and he's asked if he still has the same boat. What was it called again? The Asp, Joe replied with a nod. No, unfortunately, it was ruined in a storm a few years back. I've got a new one now. So what I love is that there's this stuff that's just slipped in, that's been put in there for Jane Austen lovers. So if you've never read Jane Austen, you could read these books and completely enjoy yourself. But if you love Jane Austen, there's stuff in here that feels like it's just for you as a fan. And then here's another example. Joe's partner, Sergeant Beale, he says to her, Sergeant Beale isn't a bad cop, but she has a tendency to be impulsive. I admire her spirit, but sometimes she lacks good sense. And that totally seems to me like a reference to Louisa from Persuasion. So yeah, This was just really fun to read. I also read Danger at the Cove by Hannah Dennison. This is the second book in the Island Sisters mystery. What I absolutely love about this series is that it is set on an island off the coast of Cornwall. So setting-wise, it's perfection. And what I love is that it's set in a hotel that is all about 1930s golden age authors, and how can I not love that as well? Each room is named after a golden age author, and there are first editions of these golden age authors' books available to read at the hotel. I mean, come on, right? So Evie and her sister Margot are finishing up some renovations at the hotel just in time for their opening day. And then Margot tells Evie that her friend from Hollywood, Louise, who is grieving the death of her husband, is coming over for a visit last minute. You know, the hotel's not even ready, it's not even open, but Louise is coming over. And then, in the midst of all of this, a member of the hotel staff is murdered, and so the police have to come onto the island to try and investigate. And yeah, it's just a fun, it was a fun mystery that I enjoyed that one as well. Now this one I read as a recommendation from someone from my real life mystery book club. This is Rabbit Hole by Mark Billingham. Police Patient Killer, which is Alice. So this one was just a really fun, fast-paced, I don't know, maybe it's more a thriller, I would say. Probably it's more of a thriller. So it's set in, it's set on a psychiatric ward, and our main character is Alice, and everything's from her perspective. It's told in the first person, and someone on her ward has been murdered. And so Alice, she was like, listen, I used to be in the police and I can help, I can investigate. And you find out that she's there because of some sort of traumatic event that happened, that has given her PTSD, and that's why she is currently on the ward. Yeah, I don't want to say too much more because I don't want to ruin this one, but yeah, it was very twisty turny. You don't know who to trust. Unreliable narrator, definitely. So yeah, this one was a fun ride as well. And for those of you who care, there was definitely language in this one as well. So some people can ignore that. Some people don't like that. I thought I would just mention it. Okay, and then I did a buddy read of The Egyptologist by Arthur Phillips with Donna from Studio in the Library. I love buddy reading with her. We have great conversations. This book was weird. I was kind of just expecting a story about, you know, somebody doing excavations in Egypt in the 20s, but boy was this story ever weird. It's two timelines, the 1920s in Egypt and then the 1950s, where someone is revealing what they knew about what had happened in the 1920s. What's interesting is that this is all told, it's an epistolary novel, so it's all told in letters and journals. So that is always interesting. I always love when an author kind of finds a different way to tell a story, and so an epistolary story is always interesting. But yeah, this one, it did not have any likable characters. Everybody who you get perspective from that are writing the letters, everybody is unreliable for one reason or another. You're never really sure what's true and what's not. And I think that that's ultimately why I wasn't really a fan of this story, because there was no character that I could kind of follow that I liked. And because I was you're constantly like, okay, is this true or not? Is this true or not? And yeah, so if you like a story that is told in a very unusual way, then this could be the book for you. Okay, and I also read, or did kind of, let's call it, one investigation in Could You Survive Midsomer by Simon Brew. This is basically a choose your own adventure where you're the detective, a murder has happened and you have to try and solve it. And this was totally fun. I love how many decisions were required of me as the detective. And I also loved, at the end, you're sent to the back of the book. You have to add up certain things, and you're sent to the back of the book for your performance review. There are many different possible endings to your Midsomer adventure. Playing through the book again and making different decisions might lead you to uncover more secrets. If you want a sense of how much of it you discovered and suggestions for improvement, then step this way for your performance review. And so I went to the number and I was told kind of how I did. And so I thought it was good. The first time, this one time that I did it, I solved part of the mystery, but not all of it. And so I did okay, but I will definitely be trying again and seeing if I can actually solve the murder. So this was just really, really fun. Okay, and then for Shaketember, I read Shakespeare of London by Marchette Chute. This was published in 1949, and I really enjoyed this. It's a look at Shakespeare, but with a real focus on the theater and the plays that he wrote, and I just really, really enjoyed it. So there's a couple of things I marked that I wanted to share with you. This is an author who obviously loves Shakespeare and does not want to address any kind of funny business. This book is an attempt to bring a very great man into the light of common day. It is an attempt to show William Shakespeare as his contemporaries saw him, rather than as the gigantic legendary figure he has become since. He was once life-size, and this is an attempt at a life-sized portrait. This book is not a literary biography. It does not concern the part of Shakespeare that is immortal and for all time. It concerns only the part of him that was mortal and belonged to the Elizabethan age. His plays are not discussed as literature. His plays are not discussed as literature, but only as they relate to the working problems of the London's stage. So yeah, I really liked kind of how she framed, he or she, I'm not sure, framed the narrative for this book. And so there's just a few things that I marked that I wanted to share. So she talks in the author talks in one chapter about the first theater that Burbage built, and he built it in North London in a liberty so that he didn't have to follow the rules of the City of London. When Brain died in 1586, his widow carried on the feud with Burbage, and the climax came 4 years later in what might be called the War of the Broomsticks. Margaret Brain armed herself with a court order and some male assistants and went to install her own gatherer in the theater that Burbage was convinced was his. Accompanying her was a friend named Robert Miles, his son Ralph, and a soap maker named Nicholas Bishop, who was to act as the gatherer, someone who is taking money. Ellen Burbage was the first to see the little procession and was quite undismayed by it. That redoubtable woman told them to leave at once or her son would break all their heads. James Burbage reinforced this information by putting his head out of one of the windows, improving on his wife's flow of fine Elizabethan invective. He called the respectable Mrs. Brain a murdering whore, and said that no court order was going to take his theater away from him, adding that if my son come, he will thump you hence. At this point, his son Cuthbert arrived, as on cue, as it were, and indulged in what the opposition called great and horrible oaths. Although Cuthbert maintained at the subsequent trial that neither he nor his father had threatened to beat Miles. The case was otherwise with Burbage's younger son, Richard, who at this point entered the fray. He seized a broomstick and fell upon Robert Miles, who was still clutching the court order, while Mrs. Burbage assisted him with enthusiasm. Nicholas Bishop, the soap maker, ventured to suggest that Mrs. Brain was within her legal rights, and Richard Burbage threatened to beat him also, scornfully and disdainfully playing with the dependent's nose, as Bishop later testified. Richard was evidently enjoying himself thoroughly, for when the first of the actors arrived to dress for the afternoon performance, he found him still holding the broomstick and laughing. The Burbages were left in full possession of the field, and their own gatherers remained in the theatre. Mrs. Brain brought suit at once, and after a very careful and thorough investigation of the case had been made by two masters in chancery, James Burbage was given sole legal possession. Isn't that fantastic? Okay, I thought this was fascinating as well. The Londoners loved words, and they were capable of getting half drunk on a really gorgeous flow of rhetoric. Isn't that great? Okay, and so the author also talks about Robert Greene, and in a pamphlet that he wrote, let's see, does it say what it's called? Oh yes, Greene's Groatsworth of Wit was the last pamphlet that he wrote, and mostly autobiographical. And he says in there, Green was reminded of the crow in Aesop who strutted in borrowed feathers, but this time he used the image not to attack actors in general, but one actor in particular. Quote, there is an upstart crow, beautiful with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. And being an absolute Johann factotum, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country. It is known from the evidence of a court document 2 years later that William Shakespeare was by this time a prominent actor in London, and he also seems to be the only actor at the time who was also writing plays. The fact that Shakespeare is the actor whom Green is attacking is further indicated by the pun on his name as the only shake scene in the country. And the identification is reinforced by Green's phrase about a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. The phrase is a slanting reference to a scene from a London success that was currently attracting large audiences, and that was from Henry VI. So I found that fascinating because there is a show that we get on BritBox called Upstart Crow that I love. It's a comedy about William Shakespeare, and it's very entertaining. So I thought that was interesting to read where that name comes from. So the author also talks about some of the poetry that Shakespeare wrote at the beginning of his career. He would have gone on writing handsome, ornate poems that were as rich in detail as a well-made tapestry, but equally lacked the breath of life. When the special Renaissance cult that produced such poems receded at the end of the decade, Shakespeare's work would have receded with it. He would have become one of the many minor Elizabethan writers whose works interest the literary scholar, but have no life at all for the general public. One of the qualities that makes a writer great is his instinct for avoiding a pitfall that can destroy him. Whether or not Shakespeare was consciously aware of the fact, his genius depended on having complete writing freedom. More than any writer in the world's history, Shakespeare needed space around him, space to try anything he wanted without any literary rules to hamper him or any literary specialists to eye his work and pass their small judgments. So here's another quote that shows just how much this author loves Shakespeare. The next 16 years of Shakespeare's life are of a creative violence unparalleled in literary history. It was as though a great wind had suddenly found its true course and could blow free. This I thought was fascinating. So Shakespeare's plays often opened with a prologue. So very famously from Romeo and Juliet, you know, the prologue from Romeo and Juliet is really famous, but spoils the play. You learn everything that's going to happen in the prologue. And I always found that really strange. And so this quote, learning this, was really interesting. The Elizabethan theatre was not based on the element of surprise, but on the gratification of expectation. If anyone did not know the general plot of Romeo and Juliet before he entered the theatre, the speech of the prologue solved the matter for him. The actor who played this part cannot be envied, since it was up to him to capture the attention of an excitable, individualistic audience, most of whom had been waiting for a long time, since the places were not reserved, and many of whom were probably busy chewing. Shakespeare's prologue did not go in for mystification. He stated clearly and at once that the play was about two unlucky lovers who were eventually going to die because their parents were having a feud. Then the two minor actors who played Capulet's men came on with swords and bucklers, and the play began. If it was a success with the audience, it would be put into the regular repertoire of the company and probably played again sometime the following week. If it was a failure, it would be quietly forgotten and another play would go into rehearsal immediately. Romeo and Juliet was an instant success. Isn't that fascinating that Elizabethan theatre was based on the gratification of expectation? I find that so fascinating. Here is some more elegant prose by this nonfiction author. Even at its lowest level, Hamlet is a magnificently constructed piece of melodrama with enough blood and pageantry and swordplay to please the sleepiest 10-year-old. and at its highest it travels so far into the secret countries of the heart that even the wisest should be able to see a new landscape unfolding in front of him. And I was reading this, of course, when I found out that Queen Elizabeth had passed away. And so there was a lot of discussion at that time about how weird it is to now have a king. Because my entire life, and the majority of my parents' lives as well, Elizabeth has been the Queen of England. And it's just such a bizarre thing to think that we now have a king. So to read this was really apropos. The new ruler of England was James VI of Scotland, henceforth to be known as James I of England. Londoners found it a curious experience to be waiting to greet a king, since no one under 50 could remember a time when there had been a man on the throne of England. Isn't that interesting? Okay. And then the last one on the retiring of Shakespeare. Shakespeare had good reason to retire. He had been an actor for 20 years, and it was a profession that called for strenuous and unremitting physical activity, with no rest even in the summer or at Christmas. He had also spent 20 years of intense mental activity creating the greatest series of plays and the most wonderful procession of people that one man ever fathered in the history of the world. If any single consideration made him decide to leave the theater, it may very well have been sheer weariness. He had worked long enough and hard enough, and he was entitled to a rest. So there you have it, Shakespeare of London by Marchette Chute. I really enjoyed that read. And then last but not least, I read The Office BFFs for something a little bit different. Tales of the Office from two best friends who were there, Jenna Fischer and Angela Kinsey. I've recently become a really big fan of their podcast, the Office Ladies podcast, and I just find it very entertaining. The two of them are just very entertaining to listen to. And so when I saw that my library had this book, I thought that I would check it out. For those who listen to the podcast, there's not a lot that's new. They do include a lot of photographs, so that was really interesting to look through. And so yeah, it was enjoyable. Okay, so there you have it. That's what I've been reading recently. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books. Did you participate in Shaketember? Did you read anything about Shakespeare? I would love to chat with you about that. And I will see you for another video soon. Bye.